Good afternoon. Welcome to the BSI conference, The Digital World, Cybersecurity in a Changing World. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'm Tim McGarr from BSI, the UK's national standards body, and I will be chairing the event this afternoon. As a reminder, this is a listen-only conference that is being recorded. We'd like the day to be as interactive as possible and welcome questions that you may have via the Q&A function. To help me and the speakers, please keep your questions as clear and concise as possible. Also, thank you to those of you who submitted your questions in advance of the conference. To pose a question, simply click on the Q&A button in the side panel and post your question. If you experience technical difficulty at any time, please submit your technical issue in the Q&A function and our technical support team will assist you. BSI will be sending a follow-up email after the conference has taken place with a link to the recording and the presentations used today. Next slide, please. So this conference is the latest in a long series of conferences that BSI have done on cybersecurity for many years. So there's over 30 years of cybersecurity standardization, which many of you will know about, which has been protecting organizations and economies. Today, we're going to hear about three of the very most important standards around cybersecurity in the world, and the cybersecurity experts who've been involved in their development. So rather than read through the agenda, I think it's better to go straight into the proceedings for today. If you want to learn more about any of our presenters, all their biographies are on the website. Next slide, please. So for our first session, we're going to learn more about 27001, what is undoubtedly the most widely used cybersecurity standard in the world. We're going to hear more about the most recent third edition. So today we have two presenters in this session. So Bridget Kenyon, CISO for Shared Services Connected Limited, and Steve Watkins, the chair of the BSI Cybersecurity Committee and director of Kinsnall Consulting. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tim. Good afternoon, everyone. Brief introduction from me. My name is Steve Watkins. I'm a director at Kinsnall Consulting, as Tim's just explained. I've been working with ISMS, Information Security Management System standards, since the mid to late 90s. Over the years, I've been increasingly involved in contributing to the development of 27001 and the related standards and the operation of the accredited certification scheme. That's included being contracted to UCAS as a technical assessor for ISMS and ITSMS schemes for something like 12 years, I think it is now. I'm currently a director with Kinsnall Consulting. As I said, Kinsnall provides support and advice related to cybersecurity, information security and privacy protection standards and certification schemes to organisations such as some of those listed on the screen. Those who know me may well recognise the third of those organisations, GRC International Group, by under the guise of its subsidiary, IT Governance in the UK, where I was working up to just over a year ago. Just before I hand over to Bridget, who we're all, certainly I'm grateful that Bridget's delivering part of this session, and I suspect you will be come the end of it as well. Just before I hand over, I should mention that my presentation and my slides, when I get to them, it's purely my views. I'm not talking on behalf of any of the organisations I've mentioned or those represented on the screen. That's it from me for now. I'm going to hand you over to Bridget. Bridget, all yours.
Thanks very much, Steve. Right, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this presentation. Let's see if we can go to the next slide. Marvellous. Right, my name is Bridget Kenyon, and for those of you who haven't come across me before, congratulations and welcome to my presentation. So I am going to be talking to you mainly about the changes and the impact of the new revision of 27001. About me, I have been working in information security since about the year 2000. And I started actually working at DERA in Malvern, so that's the MOD. And since then, I've done some hands-on work in things like systems and network administration. But I've also done a lot of work on the security side. It is the thing that I really fell in love with way back then, and I've stuck with it ever since. I've been a PCI QSA, so that's payment card security. I've worked on the IG toolkit, that's patient data, specifically unconsented patient data, which you really have to look after. I have been head of information security at Warwick University and UCL. Most recently, prior to my current role, I was global CISO at Thales eSecurity, and then European CISO for Thales DIS. Right now, I am the CISO for SSCL, Shared Services Connected Limited, which is basically an organisation, a quarter owned by the Cabinet Office, which provides back office services, things like pensions, to government and defence, and also to the Met Police. So in my spare time, in between my actual paid roles, I also moonlight as an ISO contributor and committee member and editor. I started on that back in 2006 or thereabouts, and I have been editor for 27013, and then I went on to edit 27014, which just got published, and now I'm editor. Well, just finished being editor, because when a standard is published, you cease to be the editor because it no longer needs an editor at that moment. So I am the ex-editor of all of these standards, including 27001, which was published, I think, about a week ago. Okay, so that's where we stand with me. Right, now I'm going to be assuming, and apologies if my assumption is incorrect, that you know what 27001 is. And I'm also going to just call it 27001 for the purposes of brevity, but what I actually mean is ISO/IEC 27001. So I'm going to be focusing on things like what has changed since its publication and what impact that might have. And I'm going to also focus on things like Annex A and how that works in practice. Right, so let's talk about what's happened since its last publication. Well, firstly, there was corrigendum number 1, which happened in approximately 2014. Now, in some cases, the date changes because there's one date when ISO publishes a corrigendum, and then there's a second date when the document is published as a British standard by BSI. And sometimes that can be in separate years, obviously if it's over a Christmas. So Annex A was clarified. This was a direct consequence of a change to 27002. Because, as you may know, 27002 and 27001 are in lockstep. When one changes, the other has to. So 27002 had a slight alteration in the way it was describing. This was a section to do with asset inventories, in fact. And originally it said assets associated with information, and somebody very pointedly said, hang on a minute, you mean you don't need an inventory of information? Thus followed some discussions along the subject of, is there such a thing as an information asset? This phrase was not a popular phrase, so we ended up having to kind of finesse it, and we ended up with information, other assets associated information, which everybody was willing to get behind and push. So that changed in 27002, and as a result, we had to make a slight tweak to 27001. Slight tweaks are available for a limited period. We then ended up with another slight tweak, and this was to change a section of 6.1.3, which is about risk assessments, statements of applicability, that sort of stuff. It was kind of a bit of a wall of text, a whole load of elements with commas between, and it wasn't entirely clear what that meant. So what we did was just take those elements and split them out into bullet points. Again, very minor change, just for clarity. So that unfortunately left us with a situation where we hit 27002 being updated, and we had run out of options to add another corrigendum. You only get 2 chances to do corrigendums before you have to go for a full revision. So voila, as soon as 27002 was going to be revised, we knew we had to do something with 27001, and it turns out we couldn't do a corrigendum. We couldn't actually call it an amendment. Technically, it was going to be a new revision. Lots of discussions about whether it was a draft amendment and so forth. So here we are, new revision of 27001. Okay, I'm going to divide the changes into 2 sections. So hold your horses, because we're going to do a little bit on Annex A before we go into the bit about what are all these changes scattered around? I'll start with the stuff that was in the design spec at the beginning of the revision. Firstly, you sort of tidy up after yourself. The other core agenda, the two we just mentioned on the previous page, those get rolled into the full revision. So you can fix them and they're done and it's all nice and tidy. Then obviously the reason for the whole thing, the updating of Annex A. And then there was a side effect of the updating of Annex A, which actually affected the main text of 27001. And that is in 6.1.3c, and I wouldn't say I've memorized every one of these, but they are starting to be horrifyingly recognizable. You remove the phrase control objectives because 27002 no longer uses that phrase. It no longer has a section or a subsection within each control or a control objectives at all. So we just got rid of the phrase control objectives from a little list. And we also changed the word control to information security control. Again, this was to match up with the way that 27002 was doing things, which was to be very, very explicit about a control being an information security control rather than just any old control. And we also made a slight update to note 1 under 6.1.3c, which describes Annex A as a list of, it now describes Annex A as a list of possible controls, rather than a recommended list or a complete list or a comprehensive list. I believe the original text said comprehensive list. Now it says possible controls, just a list of possible controls. And this was a very, very carefully chosen phrase. Why, I hear you ask? Well, to answer that question, let's ask a question. What is Annex A? Now, bear with me, because there's a lot of bullets on this, and it has a narrative. Bear with me. Right, so firstly, people often say, aha, Annex A, this is a list of requirements. And in fact, when you give someone who hasn't ever come across 27001 a copy of the document, they go, right, okay, flip it, ooh, lists of controls. And they kind of zoom in on that, and they think of that as kind of, wow, yes, we do that, we're good. It isn't a set of requirements. The use of Annex A is normative. The contents of Annex A are not normative. Normative is special ISO speak for compulsory or required, and very specifically in a certification sense. So choosing to include or exclude an individual control within Annex A is up to you, and I'll show you how that works. But Annex A does not contain a set of requirements. Okay, let's try again. Best practice guide. We can pretty much shoot this one down in flames immediately because of the word best. Best practice leads you down a very unfortunate direction where lies a number of court cases where people have proven that although they did what they could, it wasn't the best theoretically possible solution. So best practice, bad phrase. Okay, let's dial that back down. And let's put the line through best practice. Okay, let's try good practice. Okay, this Annex A is a good practice guide. Well, no, because it's a whole load of controls and some of them might not work in your organization. They might not be appropriate. They might actually give you a negative result in terms of your business capabilities. They might get in people's way. People might work around them and end up with worse security. So it isn't necessarily good practice. Okay, so let's dump good practice. Let's just take this right back down. We've tried a good practice guide. Let's try striking some words out now. It's a guide, right? Okay, it takes you in a direction and it shows you where to go and it's giving you information and it's kind of instructive. It's telling you what to do. No, it's not a guide either. I will get to the bit on what it actually is, I swear. Okay, let's try reference set of controls. And now this is taken in part from the phrasing that was used as the title of 27002 originally. I'm not going to go into details on 27002 because I don't want to steal Sabrina's thunder, but the concept of a reference set, of something you refer to, something that is rock solid and stable and is a list of things, and yeah, it's good, it's reliable, it's what you want it to be. You can see we're actually heading straight back in the direction of guide, aren't we? It's just a really wordy official way of saying guide. and it isn't that either. In fact, the phrase I like to use, and I would like to credit a very good friend of mine, Dick Price, for this phrase, is a supermarket of controls. Because, well, I'll come to the next slide. So yeah, I like to call it a supermarket of controls. The other phrase I like to use, in fact, is a collection, because it doesn't make any representations about suitability. Okay, so let's just talk back again about this whole best practice guide, because I can, generally speaking, when you use the phrase best practice guide, people really like the idea of there being something at the end of 27001, which is a best practice guide. So why isn't it, or why shouldn't it be? Well, I'm saying it's not an intended use. That's perhaps not a sufficiently good explanation. Let's keep going. It's not intended to be comprehensive. So back to this supermarket analogy. In most supermarkets, say Tesco, for example, you won't necessarily find, I don't know, edible gold leaf. You might need it, but it won't be in Tesco. So, and a supermarket is not necessarily going to have everything you need. And not everything is going to be relevant to your situation. You might be deciding to make, I don't know, a really nice hot pot, and you don't need ice cream to make the hot pot. Just because it's in the supermarket doesn't mean that you need it. Equally, buying everything in the supermarket, that's a bit too much. You can see this analogy is actually quite effective. Also, controls have a lifespan. You might need a control for a particular purpose. Maybe you're outsourcing, and then you choose that you don't need to outsource. Well, you've chosen to insource something that we were originally giving to a third party to provide for you. And the controls relating to third party provisions or outsourcing no longer apply. So controls come and go. And the idea of Annex A as being all of it is always relevant to everybody just doesn't work, as long as soon as you add the axis of time. It's also incredibly hard to get traction if you start treating Annex A as a checklist. I've seen this happen. I went to an organization, a good friend of mine said, can you come look at my ISMS because it's not working? And I sat down with them, and the first thing they showed me was an Excel spreadsheet with every last item in Annex A. And they'd specified who should be doing it, when they should do it. And they said, we're having great difficulty getting budget. And it was quite hard to, it was difficult to even raise the topic of the fact that it perhaps wasn't the way this was intended to be used. And the reason that they were having trouble was much like if you turned up at a supermarket and tried to buy the whole thing and your bank balance said no, it just doesn't work, does it? Everybody's got a budget and you have to have a reason for something, and it's in Annex A is not sufficient reason. Also, and this is something that people sometimes aren't aware of, so forgive me if this is obvious, there are other standards within the 27000 series which contain sector-specific controls. So 27017, I think, is about cloud security, and it has very specific controls related to that context. Equally, 27010 is for telecoms. So if you work in the telecoms industry, you should look at 27010 because it will have stuff in there that is not in 27002 or Annex A. And again, would you really buy everything in the supermarket? So, all in all, not recommended as a best practice guide. Okay, I've talked a lot about what not to do. So what exactly are you supposed to do with Annex A? Well, Annex A is to support certification to the compulsory part of 27001, which is clauses 4 through 10. The process as follows. 1, hide Annex A. Put it in a box. Put the box in a different room. Ignore it. Ditto 27002, because obviously 27002 is basically all the content, and Annex A is just all the headings from 27002. Do a risk assessment. What are your risks? What are your concerns? You could go with assets, threats, and vulnerabilities, whatever methodology you fancy. 27001 does not mind. You can, of course, reference 27005, which has just been published, and Masata will be talking about that shortly. And that gives you some options for risk assessments. Lovely. And within that, you should probably work out what level of risk you're comfortable with, and therefore what controls you need to apply to satisfy your own risk appetite. But that's not the end of the story, of course, because there are other people on the planet, and there are governments that give you laws. There are customers who give you contracts. There are regulators that give you regulations. So those extra things have to be added in. And voila, you have a master list of controls, which in the context of the world of supermarkets, you can call your shopping list. You could even say that you've labeled it with provenance, i.e. the person in the family that that particular control is intended for. So there's, I don't know, ice cream for somebody, and there's gold leaf for somebody, and there's, I don't know, hot pot ingredients, I don't know, lamb, potatoes, something for yourself. Okay, so you've got a shopping list, great. What now? Okie dokie, and this is the last slide of how to use Annex A. So now you're allowed to look at Annex A. You can go into the other room, you can open the books, you can take out Annex A, you can probably take out 27002 at this time as well, because it will be very, very useful. And you do a matching exercise. So you're not saying, because it's in the supermarket, I need to buy it. You're saying, okay, it's in the supermarket, but it's not on my list. Did I actually need it? So you're walking around in the supermarket, you see some salt. Oh, good Lord, I've run out of salt and I really need it for my hot pot. You've got a reason for it. It's, let's pretend it's your own thing. So it's your risk assessment. So you've actually, what you've realized in looking at Annex A is that you missed something in your risk assessment. It's not because it's in the supermarket that you added it. It's not because it's in Annex A. It's because Annex A has helped you realize you missed something in your risk assessment. Equally, if you have gold leaf on your shopping list and you actually need it, somebody is doing a cake and they want to put edible gold leaf on it, that's fine. It may not be in the supermarket, but just because it's not in the supermarket doesn't mean you don't need it. So again, that's absolutely fine. Just write it all down. So if you need it, describe why you need it. You've already done that in the previous slide. If you don't need it, not applicable, not relevant, something about, just to show that you actually cared enough to look at that control. And there you have a statement of applicability, and a really very solid one. That is pretty bulletproof if you've done it that way. And 27002 helps you on the implementation and designing of controls that you have chosen that you need that happen to match 27002 Annex A. So all good. Right, so we've gone through the obvious stuff, but as you may have noticed, there are other changes sprinkled through 27001. So what's all that about? Quite simply, and I could have done this as individual items, but what the hell. This is intended to align 27001 with what is known as the common text. If you have had a look at other management system standards in the last couple of years, especially say 9001 or 20,000 Part 1, or I think 14,001, I think that's environmental, you'll notice that they all look hauntingly familiar. In fact, they are almost exactly identical to each other. And that is because they use the common text, which is designed by ISO and is documented in, I think it's called Annex SL these days. It went through a phase of being called Annex L in the ISO directives Part 1. So in fact, if you copy and paste 9001 and just take the word quality and replace it with information security, you will have something which is almost identical to 27002. Oh, sorry, 27001. Yeah. 27001 has some special parts. You're allowed to add extras, and you are allowed to diverge from the original in the introduction. So you'll find 9001 has a ton of stuff in the introduction on Plan, Do, Check, Act, for example. But the basic text is mandatory. And when we kicked off a full revision, the changes since the last time we aligned with the basic text, the common text, had to be implemented. And those changes haven't been major changes to the changes to the common text in the last, well, since 2013. They haven't been major changes. They're little editorial changes and clarifications to try and make it more obvious what the subject of the material is and how it fits together and how things should be interpreted. So let's pick an example. So I decided to pick 9.3, known to its friends as management review. It was previously one block of text, and now it is 3 sub-clauses. We could call them sub-clauses, one of which is entitled General and is actually a copy and paste of the first part of the original paragraph. The second sub-clause is titled Management Review Inputs, and it actually has a new bit in there, and we'll come back to that. The third part is known as Management Review Results. Again, it's a copy and paste of the, I think, last 2 sentences in the original paragraph. Okay, so what is this added item all about? Okay, let's have a look at it. At the top, you have the old text, and at the bottom, you have the new text. Right, so item A is absolutely identical word for word. Item B is absolutely identical word for word, and all of the grammatical elements are going to be the same as well, the punctuation. And you have this new bit, changes in needs and expectations of interested parties that are relevant to the information security management system. These are things that need to be included in the management review or considered in the management review. If you look very carefully at C, you will realize that it is in fact arguable that it is simply an extension of what is in item B, because changes in needs and expectations of interested parties could very easily be argued to be an external/internal issue, depending on whether the interested party is an external interested party or an internal interested party. So if you're taking this in a very literal sense, you could even argue that item C in this list is not necessary because it is implicit in item B. What they've done is they've added an item C just to make absolutely clear that interested parties, their needs and expectations do matter, and changes in them should be taken into account during a management review. So it's sort of explicit common sense, I suppose you could say. So that's where we stand. I'm just going to put in a very quick slide on scope, very quickly. That is just in case people didn't know, just to be on the safe side, you are able to certify part of your ISMS. So if you choose to have an ISMS which covers your whole organization, you can choose to certify just your IT department. Again, this should be obvious. Right, so on to my very last slide for everyone to enjoy briefly. 27001 is aligned with 27002, and it now matches the common text, as we've discussed, the current version of the common text. There aren't any major technical changes, and it shouldn't be high impact unless you're using Annex A as a source of requirements. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention, and I shall pass on to my good colleague, Steve.
Thanks, Bridget. So as we've seen, we've got a new standard. So ISO IEC 27001 2022. Whatever the extent of change, the very fact that there is a change has a consequence for a conformity assessment scheme, or as most of us refer to it, a certification scheme. I'm going to explain what this consequence is, what it means to various organizations that operate or choose to benefit from the certification scheme. And I'm going to start with, if I can, there we go, move on the slide, that's it. So I'm going to start with the organizations involved in the accredited certification scheme. So starting at the bottom of this slide with certification clients or organizations such as yours and mine that might want to benefit from a certificate of conformity saying that they operate an information security management system that conforms with the requirements of the standard ISO 27001. An organization, as I'm sure many of you are aware, that wants this certificate engages an audit body, a certification body, to come in and conduct an audit, typically 2 audits to start with, to hopefully, if the information security management system reflects the requirements of 27001, issue a certificate stating exactly that. There are numerous certification bodies out there that organizations around the globe could appoint to come and conduct this audit. The very value of a certificate of conformity to 27001 is that both the organisations management and board and others, so interested parties, stakeholders, customers, can associate a degree of confidence or comfort with that certificate. Therefore, all of the certificates within the accredited certification scheme, they offer benefit because they're of an equivalence. They provide a similar degree of confidence and assurance with regards to information security management. Now, if each of these organizations that holds a certificate is appointing a different certification body, the question is, how do we know the certificates are equivalent to each other? Well, this is where the accreditation mechanism comes into play. Each of those certification bodies typically apply to one or possibly more accreditation bodies. So the certification bodies shown in red across the middle of the screen here, they typically seek accreditation from one of the accreditation bodies, level with the purple text on the left-hand side there towards the top. And there's a selection of the accreditation bodies from around the globe shown on the screen there. And testing my my ability to recall, I think that's, please correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that's Emirates, India, Australia and New Zealand, South Africa, China, I know that's UK, and the US. They're just some of them. There's many more accreditation bodies. Exactly the issue I've just queried or raised with regards to how do we know the certification bodies provide a similar level of audit, competence, probity, confidence in the certificate that they issue. How do we all know, and the certification bodies know, that the accreditation bodies are operating in a similar manner, provide a similar check and challenge, and indeed all recognise each other's roles as accreditation bodies? Well, they sign up to an organisation called the International Accreditation Forum, the IAF. And if you want to look at the IAF website, it's www.iaf.nu. NU. So all of the accreditation bodies sign up to the IAF for a multilateral recognition arrangement or agreement, effectively, which involves them working to agree practices, conducting peer reviews, etc. So we get this network or pyramid of arrangements, all designed to ensure that the certificates issued by certification bodies to organizations have this equivalence. They can be compared to each other and a similar degree of confidence can be derived from them. Of course, knowing what to look for in a certificate matters immensely. So the scope statement, Bridget made brief reference to a scope statement earlier. The scope statement on a certificate is immensely important, and indeed it references certificates under the accredited certification scheme will reference the specific version of the statement of applicability that the organisation was audited, had in place when it was audited. So the very fact that we're changing the key criteria, the international standard that the certificate is going to reference, requires some arrangements to be rolled out to ensure that the confidence remains. And that relies on a number of factors at those organisations in this cascade, if you want, the accreditation bodies and the certification bodies, and indeed the certification clients. So let's consider the requirements or considerations those organisations may need to revisit in light of the change from 27001 2013 to 27001 2022. So starting this time towards the top of the screen, accreditation bodies. Accreditation bodies such as UCAS, CNAS, etc. They deploy assessors who look at the practices at certification bodies' offices. They look at effectively their management system to run a scheme and look at the competence arrangements, the processes, the templates, any technological solutions they use to ensure that they service and reflect the latest version of the standard as appropriate, so 27001 2022. In doing that, the certification body, of course, needs to prepare in advance to ensure that a number of roles and processes, templates and technologies are all aligned with the 2022 version of the standard. And the roles that we can find at most certification bodies would include, obviously, the auditors. They need to understand the consequence of an updated specification, so 27001 2022, what it means, what the changes mean, and other roles in certification bodies include application reviewers, who confirm that an organisation that's applying is one that they can service, that they have the competence within the auditor pool to service that client effectively, and that they can schedule the audit activity appropriately. And there's also the role in a certification body of a decision maker, whether that's an individual or a group of people who, independent of the audit team, review the audit pack and take an audit decision to say, yes, on the basis of the information provided, we can issue a certificate with the certification body's brand on it because we have the confidence that the audit check and challenge, if you want, or confirmation of conformity is robust enough. So that's the certification body. They need to make sure that their people, their personnel are appropriately competent, their processes and templates are updated as may be necessary, and if they've got any software solutions or technological solutions, increasingly we're seeing automated report templates, etc., that they are updated to reflect the new sets of controls, references, clauses, etc. And then we have organizations implementing an information security management system reflecting the new version of 27001, the latest edition. Which personnel might be affected by these changes? Well, internal auditors should be aware that there's this new control set and the other changes. Implementers generally should be aware of the 2022 version of the standard, particularly if their implementation is likely to run for a year or more, and I'll come on to that in just a moment. And I would suggest also information security risk assessors and risk owners should be aware of the new control set, so that they can make suitably informed decisions when they're reviewing residual risks post-risk treatment, where that's relevant. In order to move from the 2013 set of arrangements to the 2022 arrangements, it requires a controlled progression, if you want, or transition, as the phrase is used. So this starts with the IAF, who publish transition arrangements, and indeed the IAF published its transition arrangements in August of this year. They set out the requirements for accreditation and certification bodies. Each accreditation body is likely then to publish its own transition statement, which explains what it expects or requires of its certification bodies. That is, the certification bodies that the individual accreditation body accredits. Each certification body will then in turn typically publish a transition statement explaining to their clients, so the organizations with certification to 27001 explain what the certification body has as requirements for them to facilitate transition. That all seems quite straightforward. Of course, we need to recognize, if you recall from an earlier slide, that some certification bodies choose to be accredited by more than one accreditation body. And as each statement through this cascade becomes tailored to the individual organization's requirements and context, there will be slight variations creeping in. Either way, organizations which hold certification to the 27001, whoever your certification body is, look at their transition statement once they've published it and look to reflect that. So at the moment, certainly the IAF have published their transition requirements. They are published in what the IAF calls a mandatory document. So Natalie referenced transition requirements for ISO IEC 27001-2022, IAF MD26, MD standing for mandatory document. Cool. Published, as I say, in August, and this is, the screen here is a representation of the timeline that MD26 sets out. It starts with what it describes as the end of the month in which the standard is published. So the standard was published in October, so all the timelines start from the 31st of October 2022. The IAF document says that the accreditation bodies are to start assessing the certification bodies no later than 6 months on from October, the end of October, so the end of April 2023. And this is where I'm praying I counted my months appropriately and correctly. So the end of April 2023. It also states that 12 months on from the end of the month of publication, the accreditation body's transition of certification bodies will be complete. So by 31st of October 2023, at which stage certification bodies are required to conduct initial audits to the 2022 edition. This harks back to the previous slide, one of the earlier slides, where I suggested implementers may want to be aware of this as a date, and certainly the 2022 version of the standard, because if you're starting a project to design, implement, and then maintain an ISMS in accordance with the standard with the objective of achieving certification to 27001, then if your target date for that is after the 31st of October, you most definitely have to be working to the 2022 edition. If it's before that, I would suggest you need to check with your chosen certification body's requirements, transition requirements, because they may well have imposed something before that. So certification bodies need to conduct initial audits to the 2022 edition at least by the 31st of December, which implies that there will be no more initial audits to the 2013 edition of 27001 post the 31st of December 2023. Okay, so then the backstop for this transition process is 3 years from the end of the month of publication. So certification bodies are required to have transitioned all of their clients to the 2022 edition by the 31st of October 2025. As of that date, if there are certificates of conformity for 27001 2013 still in existence, they should be withdrawn by the certification body. This all sounds great in theory. This is what the transition timeline means. In practice, as we've heard from Bridget, the changes, certainly to the management system requirements, are not as material as they could have been. So they're not massively significant. The control set has changed. What does this really mean? Well, there's one key area, I think, where there is a significant impact, and it's for audit programs. And I can't bring myself to say it, those audit checklists, which goes control by control in Annex A. First off, certainly for certification bodies, certification bodies should not be assuming people are using the controls from Annex A. And Annex A's changed. The number of audit programs that we see, both internal audit and third-party audits, that use the 14 categories in the 2013 edition of 27001 and spread them out over the year, almost one a month, happily combining A5 information security policies and organization of information security, because people tend to think they sit together, and possibly one or two others combined, so you get an audit a month. Whereas the new structure in Annex A, as I'm sure Sabrina will talk to us about shortly, pulls us away from that. And dare I suggest maybe people might want to start looking at risk treatment plans and using looking at the processes that an organization uses in its ISMS and how the various controls contribute to address specific risks associated with that process to help inform an audit program or audit plan, possibly. It's just one potential consequence of this update that actually many would argue should be in place already, the use of risk treatment plans and action plans, as opposed to being driven by the control set in the standard. I'm pretty much out of time, so I'm going to just move on to a signposting slide and what I hope will be a useful reference. So I'm referencing there's a UK ISO IEC 27001 user group, largely facilitated through a LinkedIn group online, but we do occasionally have events, free of charge events, and indeed we're looking to arrange one in the not too distant future. So if you're interested in joining the user group, please do consider that. Of course, I'm going to flag Kinsnell, and I'd encourage you to visit the website there when it's launched. Of great importance, certainly for me, and I think it's going to be a useful resource for a number of people working with information security management systems, is the website that's been launched by SC27. So that's the international committee responsible for cybersecurity, information security, and privacy protection standards. That website, and you can see the URL there, and hopefully you'll all be provided a copy of the slides, and I've hyperlinked the images where appropriate. That website includes a number of things, including standing documents, which can be really useful reference points. Auditor practice notes, there's been a couple published, there's going to be a number more published in a suite of documents around audit practice notes, and various articles from the ISO and IEC organisations relevant to the remit of the committee SC27. That's it from me. Hopefully I've given you enough time to think of a question or two, but first off, I'll hand you back over to Tim.
Thank you. Steve and Bridget, quickly put your cameras on. So if we could just keep the screen up as well, please. So one of the questions we had was about where to find more about the standard and materials and get learning about it. And Steve's got some great links there that cover that all off. So I think just one quick question. It relates to something that both of you have mentioned. So yeah, it's a question I generally get as well around such things. The fact that these standards, the management system standards, don't change very much, and all the subjects they deal with change quite a lot. So cybersecurity is a field that's changed a huge amount in the last decade, and you know, they're developed by lots of people in lots of different countries. But so, just from your perspective, would you have liked to have seen more changes to the new edition, or are you happy with the balance between not to cause too much disruption, but bringing in the right relevant changes?
Bridget, do you mind if I jump in first and then I'll let you give the proper answer? So from my view, Tim, we ISO 27001, the first version, I liken it to kind of a child growing up and maturing. The first version was kind of, you'll do it this way, you haven't got a lot of choice, crack on. Is relatively prescriptive as to how you manage the processes to ensure that your information security controls and information security stance are appropriate and remain appropriate. The 2013 version kind of matured a bit. It's like the kids got to senior school, they got a bit of flexibility, and it grew up and allowed organizations to select controls from anywhere. The processes were very much about making sure that the combination of controls the organizations determined are appropriate for today and tomorrow and change over time. And this is where being a slave to Annex A is inappropriate. And I think that come through certainly to me loud and clear from Bridget's session. So yeah, the management system is not changed much. I think that's a reflection on how mature the management system standard requirements are. And if organizations embrace that appropriately, their ISMS should serve them well going forwards. And that's how almost the ISO standards, certainly management systems, safeguard themselves or guarantee longevity in an environment which is so fast changing as cybersecurity. So I've probably not answered your question at all. Bridget.
Oh no, that was an excellent answer. I've got a couple of sort of bits and pieces that kind of fit into what you've said there. One is that, okay, it's not changed a lot. And in some ways that's a good thing, because the more organizations that have taken it on, I say the more, well, inertia it's got, and the more organizations that have to change when it changes. So when it was new, not many people were using it. And as a direct consequence, changes to it were affecting fewer people and fewer organizations. As it's becoming more and more popular and more widely used, it's got more inertia, it's got more drag, because there are more people who are going to be affected by it. And you have to take into account more views and more different angles, because it was envisaged, the vision, if you like, of 27001 was a true one-size-fits-all approach. And over time, that's got better. And that leads us to a point where we have a fairly mature information security management system standard, which is based on the common text, which is by definition designed to be independent of technology and independent of change to cyber or anything else, because it's a management system standard that basically most management system standards on the ISO basis have, as I said, just copied and pasted in information security or quality or service management. So you can argue, in fact, that the reason that 27001, the main section of it, hasn't changed much is because it is focusing on the underlying processes and mechanisms via which people make decisions. It's kind of embodied common sense. And whereas the technology may change, the embodied common sense of how to make decisions and ensure that they are being carried out as you expect that they are being carried out, and being able to manage and measure that those decisions are doing what you expected them to do, that is based on something far deeper than, what version of SSL we want to chuck in the bin next. It's based on human nature, and that bit doesn't change very frequently. So you could argue that we are beginning to get into lockstep with human evolution, which is why you're not seeing much change now, because humans evolve pretty darn slowly.
That's true, very true. I think we're over time this one, so thank you very much, Bridget and Steve. So we now go on to our next segment. Next up, as already mentioned, is 27001 and 27002 are very often used in conjunction. So to now go into more depth about 27002, I'll hand over to Sabrina Feng, the editor of ISO OEC 27002. Sabrina, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sabrina Feng. I had the great pleasure to be the editor for the new edition of 27002. I think just, follow on from the conversation earlier. Actually, 27002 is a standard that's changing and need to be changed. And this is a standard about the controls, and the control need to stay in line or even ahead of the technology. So hopefully in the next 30 minutes, I will give you an overview of the changes to the new edition of the standard. Let me try to figure out, okay, I can control the slide, brilliant. So, what a journey it has been. As the editor, I'm very pleased with what we have achieved with the revision project. I believe the third edition of 27002 is a modernized, simplified, and a versatile new edition. So before I give you an overview of the new edition, I'd like to briefly take you through the journey of producing the standard. I always take the opportunity to do that and want to share the experience, and also want to encourage more people to become the experts and contributing to the standardization work. So The revision started from the study period in October 2016 at Abu Dhabi. I became the rapporteur of the study period, together with Swiss expert Peter Weiss and Swedish expert Jan Brandel, where we asked for contribution towards producing a design specification and outline document, including the document structure, title, and scope. And then the second meeting at Hamilton, where the current document structure is starting to emerge. And at Berlin in October 2017, we had the final design specification, the outline document, together with a new work item proposal to start the revision project. And this is where we have settled the structure, as you see today. And at Wuhan in April 2018, the French expert Alia Forati and Argentina expert Veronica Marinelli joined me as editors. We produced the first working draft. Then at Jorvik, the second working draft. At Tel Aviv, the third working draft. And followed by Paris, our first committee draft. Little did we know, it was the last time we met physically in person and for a long time, but the work continues. So we had 3 more meetings on Zoom, produced the second CD, the DIS, and the FDs. We had some of the most productive meetings, resolved thousands of comments through Zoom. It has especially worked well for me personally, as you know, I was able to chair the meetings at the comfort of home when I was 6 months pregnant, and then later had a 3-month-old baby. It has been a tremendous 5 years, and we had 10 meetings, produced 2 working drafts, 2 committee drafts, resolved over 10,000 comments from roughly 200 experts from more than 30 national bodies. Experts from Working Group 1, Working Group 4, IC7, IEEE, industry bodies such as ISF, ISACA, NIST, and many, many others. So the knowledge, experience, and expertise from these experts from different industries, countries, trade organizations, and academic institutions are what make me so confidently say we have produced a great new edition of 27002. It is modernized, it's simplified, and it's versatile. So now let's have a look at what has really changed in the new edition. So let's start with the title and scope. So we moved away from the term code of practice and what it implies. So the scope of the standard is better aligned with the ISMS standard and pointing out that it is firstly as a reference set of generic security controls. Second, designed for use within the context of ISO IEC 27001 ISMS. And third, it can also use standalone for implementing controls based on internationally recognized best practices. And lastly, for developing organizational information security management guidelines. I want to spend most of the time of the talk about the controls and the attributes, and that's what made the most the changes has made the most. So I will start with the key changes of the standards, the controls. So in the new edition, 93 controls are organized in 4 clauses, compared to the second edition, where 114 controls are organized in 14 clauses and 35 categories. In the previous revisions, lots of time was spent to debate around these clauses and categories. and when they were used by the users, they may not fit into the context of every organization, every industry. These categories are simply the way to organize the controls. So we decided on a very simple 4-clause structure, and we call these 4 categories themes, and namely organizational controls, people controls, physical controls, and technological controls. So the 93 controls includes 11 new controls, 24 merged controls, and 58 updated controls. So we'll take a look at this in a bit more detail later. Determining the controls is one of the most difficult discussion during the revision, some with very robust debate and challenges. We've managed to reach consensus with a new set of controls in the 4 clauses with updated guidance. We think users will find it more relevant, useful, and simpler. So just to share a few of the key considerations. So firstly, we found that the second edition has heavy focus on preventative controls, but light on detective and reactive controls. So we intended to have a good balance of preventative, detective, and reactive controls. Secondly, it is important to emphasize that information security is not just a technical topic, but covering organization, people, and physical controls too. As you can see, there are large number of organizational controls in the new edition. And thirdly, we found that there were many controls in the second edition that are closely related, and one cannot operate with the other. So we aim to merge these controls. Now let's take a look at the control structure before I move on to the details of the 93 controls. So there are 2 main changes of the control structure. First one, we introduced a new concept called attribute. So each control is associated with 5 attributes. So control types, information security properties, cybersecurity concepts, organizational capabilities, and security domains. The purpose of these attributes is to allow the controls to be filtered, sorted, and organized for different audiences and for different purposes. The results of such filtering are referred to as views. However, these attributes and their values are only examples, and organizations may disregard one or more of them and create their own. And I will spend more time later on attributes as well. The second change is the use of purpose for each control instead of objective for a group of a control. So each control now will have a purpose rather than a group of control meeting a particular objective in the previous edition. So this simplifies the standard and gives users more flexibility on determining the controls that is relevant to the organization. Now let's go through the controls. So there's 3 buckets of controls. I will start with the 58 updated controls. So majority of the second edition controls, they remain relevant, but they needed revision to bring it up to date with the latest best practice and remove some reference to obsolete technologies. So for example, the consideration of bring your own device in the remote working was added. The consideration of biometrics in authentication technologies was added. That's consideration of agile in secure development lifecycle was added. So I believe this updated guidance text will add great value to users who use the standard and supporting their implementation. Now let's have a look at the second bucket. These are 24 controls that have been merged from the second edition. So controls have been merged when 2 or more controls are inseparable in practice or otherwise closely related. And an example in the addition to controls for policy and review. So an organization cannot review a policy that it does not have, and it cannot keep a policy up to date if it does not review it. So these 2 controls are therefore inseparable and have been merged in Edition 3. Another example is a merger of the Edition 2 control for asset inventory and ownership of assets. So whilst the purpose of having an asset inventory is knowing what asset an organization has, and another is being able to assign responsibilities for looking after the assets. So they're closely related. And asset inventory without assigned ownership is incomplete. Therefore, these 2 Edition 2 controls have been merged to one. I won't go into them in detail, but most of the merging of the controls are simplifying the standard and make it easier for organizations. And finally, the third bucket is the 11 new controls. So, threat intelligence concerning the gathering of information about information security threats so that appropriate actions can be taken. And the guidance talks about strategic, tactical, and operational threat intelligence. Information security for the use of cloud services is given the special treatment because of its prominence in everyday computing these days. The new ICT readiness for business continuity control addresses the ICT continuity requirements before, during, and after disruption. Therefore, it specifically considers disruption to ICT services in contrast to the information security aspects of business continuity in general, that's addressed in Edition 2. So these Edition 2 controls are replaced by a single merged control in the latest edition, the Edition 3 of the standard. Configuration management highlights the importance of managing and secure configurations of hardware, software, services, and networks. A number of privacy-related controls, including information deletion, data masking, data leakage prevention, and the detective control on monitoring are also added. So that's very quick tour of the controls. Now I want to spend some time talk about the newly introduced concept in the standard attribute I mentioned earlier. As mentioned earlier, so attributes are different categorization of controls from the themes to present different views of the controls. I want to emphasize the use of attributes is not mandatory, and organizations and industry bodies can create new attributes that are specific to the organization or the industry bodies. So let's take a look at this in detail through some examples. In each control in the new version of 27002 has been associated with 5 example attributes with the corresponding attribute values. Control types and information security properties are fairly straightforward, commonly used categories. With the introduction of various cybersecurity frameworks in the industry, we introduced the cybersecurity concept attribute as an example. It is aligned to NIST and ISO 27101 Cybersecurity Framework Standard. The operational capability attribute is very similar to the second edition clauses, has the 15 common operational capabilities in information security management. And the last one, security domains, is aligned to the ENISA framework on minimum security measures for operators of essential services, and gives example on a major market, in particular interesting the categories on resilience, gives us more insight into our 27002 controls. And I want to emphasize again, these are examples for organizations to consider and adapt within their organization. So how can we use them? Let's look at some examples on the quick examples of one attributes to see how we can use them. So, an organization or industry body can just use simple spreadsheets, or you can use database, you can use web-based technologies to facilitate. But for illustration purposes, I just use a simple spreadsheet, and you can do this in a very simple way. In this example, so you can simply filter and look for all the controls address confidentiality of information, or you can look for integrity of information. This can be done for all the 5 example attributes or new ones you create as an organization. So for example, you can look for all preventative controls. You can look for all resilience controls. You can look for all security operational controls. So the attributes giving you the option to look for the controls meeting a specific criteria and you're interested in, and it provides the mechanism for us to do that. There are a lot of opportunities for organizations to use this feature outside of the standard. And this is where we're really excited about. So an organization can define its own attributes with different values to address specific needs within the organization. So for example, you can have values for different regulations. For example, controls addressing GDPR. You can look at maturity of your controls, fully developed, operating and effective, or you can look at ownership of controls, CIO owned, COO owned, people function owned. You can also have controls linked to different risk events or scenarios. We also see there might be great opportunity for industry bodies and associations to create attributes and values that pertinent to a particular industry or type of organization to drive standardization, consistency, and sharing best practices within that industry or the group of organizations. So that's a very quick introduction on attribute. There are some other changes of this edition as well. So we have included up-to-date terms of reference, terms and definitions in the standard, so that users do not have to go to a different standard, 27,000, to look for the meaning of the term. And we have updated these terms so that the standard can be accurately understood by all users. There are no normative reference anymore. We have introduced the subheadings. In some controls, guidance text, when it's very long and can be structured, here on the right hand of the slide, an example control, sorry, the boxes have seem to have misaligned. So the text with underline the other subheadings. Finally, there are 2 new annexes. Annex A explains how an organization can use the control attribute concept and define its own attributes. And Annex B presents the correspondence between the controls in this edition and the previous edition of the standard. Finally, before I hand over to Tim for Q&A, I just want to summarize with, this is a very quick 30 minutes whistle-stop tour. I hope it gives you a quick or high-level understanding of the changes. And I hope, you are as convinced as we are that this new edition is a modernized, simplified, and versatile new edition of 27002. And I hope you enjoy using the new standard, and I hope it will add value to your journey towards more effective information security management. And thank you for that. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Sabrina. If you could just turn your camera on too. For those of you online, you can send through any questions you may have, and we'll try and get through as many of those as we can. So that's the first sort of question I have, is sort of related to some of the previous questions we had around 27001 and how, so 27001 as the management system hasn't changed very much. It sounds like 27002 has had a lot more changes, which relates to the fact that cybersecurity has moved on a lot. So in terms of that, I mean, how it's obviously, again, like my question earlier, we're in a big international committee, lots of people involved, so no one has control over this. But how soon do you envisage that 27002 will need to be looked at again? Do you think it's 2 or 3 years, or sooner, or further down the line?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, as I said in the very beginning, on the contrary to 27001, 27002 is a standard need to constantly changing. I do think it needs a revision very quickly. In fact, it takes, as I said, in the beginning when I introduced the new standard, the ISO framework to draft standard and review standard, it's a long process. It drives consensus, it needs participation from international national bodies, and this work take nearly 5 years, and many things would happen within that 5 years. And we're also looking at the possibilities. So I'm not leaking or confirming anything, but there may be ways for international standards to have a shorter revision life cycle. And for certain type of standards, like 27002, perhaps it can be refreshed in a shorter cycle and sooner and quicker in a more agile fashion. But I do think that it's a standard requires constant review and updating so that it can be not just up to date, but actually ahead of the curve. And it's a standard should drive the best practice, not following the best practice. But if it takes 5 years to develop, it's very hard for you to drive the best practice. But still, I think the new edition is a huge improvement. It's huge amount of effort, and based on all the comments we received and we have to resolve, you can see people's interest in the standard, and there's just the expertise. The expert put into the standard is astonishing. It's really good.
Is there anything you've already seen that I know 27002, the new edition is quite recent, but is there anything you've already seen you think would fit well into the next version?
We have actually, so we have a list. We have a list of things that we feel that we could address in the next edition. I wouldn't go into the whole list. It may distract people from their looking at this standard, but we actually maintain a list of where we think it can be further addressed in the next revision.
Okay, so a question we got in, which not a standard I know very well, but someone's asked about ISO 27799, which takes 27,002 into the healthcare domain. And it's just in terms of actually taking that forward, has there been a mapping of the changes to 27,002, the recent additions? I know that, for example, BSI does track changes, but is there anything else that's sort of helped as well to do that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So, when our standard at the DIS and at this stage, so it's when the standard is fairly mature, we were fairly mature, fairly stable. We did a lot of workshops within the standard community. So, the example, the question was asked, is a healthcare standard. There's other telecommunications, and there are a whole list of standards are based on 27002, and they all need to be revised accordingly. So, a lot of projects are already ongoing, and some are being initiated. So, that I guess also I echo one of Bridget's comments. So, because it's a popular standard, and when we make a change, it impacts a lot of other standards, and then impact a whole group of users and the stakeholders. So we take the revision very seriously. We want to make sure the changes we are making are actually worthwhile and adding value to the organizations. Simply because the change required downstream with other standards and stakeholders. But but you're right, those revisions are either ongoing. I'm not familiar with exactly the stage of that particular standard, but I know all the impacted standards have done their impact assessment, and they're looking at their plans. Some has already started, some will start.
Yeah, I think it's right what you say. I mean, so I mentioned at the beginning, there's 30 years roughly of cybersecurity standardization, and 27,001 portfolio is quite wide, and that reflects the breadth of cybersecurity. But it means that it's 40 or 50 standards which people use for various different reasons, and they needs to be a good reason to update them because they need to be up to date, but equally you don't need to cause too much disruption as well.
Yeah.
So one other thing I was thinking about as you were talking is, there seems to be a lot of changes. They all seem, very good changes. It makes it simpler, improves the purpose, etc. I mean, have you had much feedback from users yet as to what their perspective is on it and how they're using it out in the real world, apart from your organisation, of course?
Yeah, I mean, so I didn't introduce myself in the beginning, but because I know I'm not a practitioner in compliance, so I don't see a lot of other organizations as much. But just for the people I have spoken with and talked about, the feedback is very positive. As you know, there's a lot of cybersecurity standards, including the NIST framework and other frameworks. They also, they're just a control list, and they don't have the guidance text ISO 27002 have. And many of those control lists will refer to 27002 for the actual guidance text. So the value of 27002 is from the text, the guidance within each of the control, as much as just the list of the control. So what I'm hearing is, people feel the guidance becoming even more helpful because it's now up to date, like and the new controls are really timely. So, things like threat intelligence, there's always, people are starting to implement this as a control already. But now they can refer to the standard, look at, what is the best practice? How do you look at strategic, tactical, and operational threat intelligence? And what do you do with them? So I'm hearing a lot of very, very positive responses. we also had interest from NIST, for example. They're really interested in the attribute, the new attribute were introduced. So there's collaboration happening there as well. So it's still early stage, but I think it's just got huge potential as well with the introduction of the attributes. It opens a whole avenue of new ways of collaboration within the industry. So I'm very excited to see how that will evolve within the industry.
So one quick question this one's put in here, my colleagues thankfully gave me the answer in advance, was about the adoptions of them. So 27,002, I believe, will be adopted by the end of November for BSI. And in terms of the question that's come through is around the BSEN ISO-IC version 27001, so European adoption. That should be taking place around May, June 2023, and BSI will be adopting it shortly after that. So that's covered off one of the questions that's come through. So something else we had submitted in advance about 27,002 was how should a less experienced organization use ISO-IC 27002? So someone who's more of a beginner to cybersecurity. Do you have any perspective on that one?
Yeah, well, very good question. I mean, it's a perfect guide to start your cybersecurity implementation or your ISMS implementation. Is 27,002. So there's two ways to do this. One is, I guess, if you are more mature in risk management, you are an expert, you understand the risk management concept, so you should always do what 27,001 asks you to do. So understand your context, do your risk assessment, understand your risk, do your risk treatment plan, and then you will implement a set of controls, and then you compare that with 27,002. So organizations can do this, need to be very mature in their risk management disciplines and their control implementation. But for other less mature organization, you can really use 27,002 as a starting point. Look at all the controls. It's not many now, 93, and it's very well segmented in terms of the types. Look at them, see how relevant they are to your organizations. A lot of them are a lot more advanced, and some are less. You can use it as an implementation guidelines. So, I do think that and read the guidance. The guidance is what's the value, where the value is about the standard. Don't just say, okay, there's a asset inventory, so I'm going to do asset inventory. But actually, if you read the standards, it gives you a lot more guidance around what do you need to think about, how do you need to do it, how can you do it, and what the best practice look like. So use the guidance text, I think.
Okay, thank you. That seems like a good point to finish up on. So thank you very much, Sabrina, for that. It's a very, very useful overview of 27,002.
My pleasure.
Thank you. On to our final session for today. So as we've heard more about some of the important changes that's happening around the 27,000 series, and as Bridget mentioned early on, risk management is a hugely important part of using 27,001 and cybersecurity generally. So to tell us more about the new edition of 27,005, the Information Security Risk Management, we have Masato Kikuchi, who is the co-editor of ISO-IC 27005. Masato, the floor is yours.
Hello. Yes, Tim, thank you. Thank you for your introduction. I'm Masato Kikuchi, and I was co-editor of ISO 27005. In this presentation, I would like to explain the change to the new edition of ISO 27005 and their impact. ISO 27005 is international standard for information security risk management, and the new edition has just been published. So first, let me remind the scope of ISO 27005. Although ISO 27005 provides guidance on implementation of the information security risk management requirement specified in ISO 27001, it can be used for any information security risk management under any framework, such as NIST Cybersecurity framework, regardless of whether the organization has ISO 27001 certification or not. ISO 27005 specifies only generic information security risk management process and requirement, and does not explain any particular risk assessment methodology in detail. Now, I would like to explain main change to the new edition of ISO 27005. Previous edition, ISO 27005 2018 was interim edition to align with ISO 27001 2013 and ensure consistency with ISO 31000 2018. ISO 27005 2022 is fully aligned with new edition of ISO 27001 and ISO 31000 2018. ISO 27005 2022 also provide guidance on using new risk identification approach, event-based approach, and comprehensive guidance on risk treatment for dealing with new edition of ISO 27001 Annex A control. I will go through these changes. Now, let's look at first change, full alignment with ISO 27001 2022 and ISO 31000 2018. One of the mandatory requirements in claiming compliance with ISO 27001 is need to perform risk management. Using ISO 27005 2022 will reduce effort for implementing or transiting to ISO 27001 2022 because they provide detailed explanation on how to implement risk management requirement of ISO 27001 2022. ISO 31000 only reflect general posture to risk management and can be applied to assess and treat any type of risk. ISO 27005 2022 provide guidance on implementation of risk management described in ISO 31000 in the context of information security. It is easy to adapt ISO 27005 2022 for information security risk management within framework of enterprise risk management. ISO 31000 define risk as effect of uncertainty on objective and describe effect can be positive, negative, or both. Corporate objective may be maximizing organization value, and enterprise risk management manage positive effect and negative effect. ISO 27005 2022 clarified the information security risks are usually associated with only negative effect of uncertainty on objective. Information security risks should arise because certain decisions are made to take opportunity, such as using IT. This understanding helps organizations correctly link information security management and enterprise risk management. Next, let's look at the second change, introduction of event-based approach. First of all, I would like to compare definition of information security with the definition of cybersecurity. I would like to explain how ISO 27005 risk identification approach can be used for cyber risk identification. As you know, information security is preservation of confidentiality, integrity, availability of information. On the other hand, cybersecurity is protection of entity, including people, society, organization, and nation from cyber risk. According to ISO 27100, Cybersecurity Overview Concept Standard. And cyber risk is associated with the potential that threat will explore vulnerability in cyberspace and cause harm to entity in the cyberspace, such as people, society, organization, and nation. ISO 27005-2022 has introduced a new risk identification approach, event-based approach. Underlying concept of conventional asset-based approach is that risk can be identified and assessed through inspection of asset, threat, and vulnerability. In event-based approach, risk can be identified assessed through evaluation of event and consequence. Event-based approach has advantage in establishing high-level strategic scenario without spending considerable amount of time in identification of asset on detail level and allows organizations to focus their risk treatment effort on critical risk. By the way, asset is one of the things that needs to be identified during the risk identification. ISO 27002-2022 divided the asset into two categories. Primary asset, primary business asset, that information or process of value organization. Supporting asset, they are component of the information system on which one of several business assets are based. These category of asset used in ISO 27005-2022 as well. By combination of event-based approach and asset-based approach, cyber attack scenario can be identified as scenario at the strategic level and operational level. Strategic scenario is identified by event-based approach. It is a view of ecosystem covering primary asset, internal, external party, and the operational scenario is identified by asset-based approach. It is a view of supporting asset, vulnerability, and threat. So this is the strategic scenario, example of strategic scenario. So event-based approach, strategic scenario should be built by analyzing different paths relevant for interaction between the organization, interest party, that all form ecosystem that risk sources can use to reach business asset. Objective for identification of interested party is to obtain clear view of ecosystem in order to identify most vulnerable link in such ecosystem. Identify risk sources using event-based assessment typically require drilling down from general level of scenario, mean this strategic scenario to the detail level. Now it is asset-based approach's turn. Asset-based approach can identify asset-specific threat, vulnerability, and allow organization to determine specific risk treatment on a detailed level. In asset-based approach, risk can be identified assessed through operational scenario, where threat explore vulnerability of supporting asset to compromise confidentiality, integrity, availability of primary asset. Operational scenario can be structured according to typical attack sequence, for example, cyber kill chain model. The approach should allow identifying critical supporting asset that can be used as a vector for entry or as a propagation relay for the model attack. Finally, let's look at third change, comprehensive guidance on risk treatment. I would like to focus on determination of control step in risk treatment. Organizations should determine all necessary control for treating risk based on risk treatment option. Necessary control can be ISO 27001 Annex A control, or control defined in another standard, or maybe control designed by organization. ISO 27005-2022 described the control type that were defined by ISO 27002-2022. They are preventive, detective, corrective control. Previous edition of ISO 27005, mean 2018 edition, concentrate too much on preventive control that reduce likelihood. New edition of ISO 27005 describe more about detective and corrective control that reduce consequence. Cyberspace, where everything is connected, is becoming more complex, uncertain, making it more difficult to prevent risk from materializing with conventional security measure. Therefore, powerful resilience that can adapt even when risk materializes is becoming important. ISO 27005-2022 give guidance on how to determine different type of control, preventive, detective, reactive. When utilizing control, organizations should first decide if it is possible to detect occurrence of event. If this is the case, detective control should be implemented. Detective control should mitigate risk if the preventive control fail. If detective control fail, then there is likely to be one or more undesirable consequences. Implementation of corrective control can assist in limitation of those consequences. Preventive control should reduce the likelihood that corrective control should ever have to be used. Now, I conclude this presentation. So, using ISO 27005-2022 can reduce effort for implementing, transiting to ISO 27001-2022, and also make it easier to implement information security risk management within the framework of enterprise risk management, and address cyber risk with a new risk identification approach, event-based approach, and more focus on detective, reactive controls that reduce consequence. Yeah, that's all. That was my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Masato. It doesn't look like we've got any specific questions coming through, so I think we'll now close the event for today.
Okay.
So to bring it to close, I just want to really thank you again, Masato, and also Sabrina, Bridget, and Steve. I also want to thank my BSI colleagues for their hard work putting the conference together today. BSI will be sending a follow-up email after the conference, the link to the recording and the presentations used today. At the end of the conference, you'll be automatically taken to a feedback survey to complete. You'll also be sent again in the follow-up email. Thank you very much, goodbye, and thank you again for all our speakers and their great work today. Thank you.